Hello, welcome to the baseball comment. Tonight I'll be breaking down the American League wildcard game between the Rays and the A's. Sleepy game, so try to stay awake with me here. That's something I noticed about these games in general. It seems like these wildcard games set up to be so interesting, and it's such a cutthroat premise of playing 162 games, and it all comes down to one game: who gets to survive and play a legit playoff series. It seems like in a lot of these games, there's just a different psychology because so often it seems like home runs are hit early on in these games at a higher rate than normal. And at the same time, teams seem to fold in these games at a higher rate than normal. So it just makes me wonder, is there something at play in the mind of the players in these games? Because so many of them follow that pattern, and it's sort of strange. Uh, so, diving into the game, I spent my first video bashing the TBS broadcast, so I thought I'd touch on that here on this game as well. ESPN was definitely a step up. I am not a fan of the A-Rod Mendoza Vasgersian booth. I think A-Rod is awesome. He's a great analyst. He sees stuff that blows my mind. Uh, he he's a savant in a way. Vasgersian is interesting because I almost compare him to like a Conan O'Brien. What I mean by that is Conan, in my mind, he's a funny guy, but his show, like early on, he built this big audience by having this really strange, offbeat, weird humor. And it seemed like sometime in the mid to late 2000s, somebody got in his ear and told him that he needed to dumb down the comedy a little bit if he was going to replace Jay Leno on The Tonight Show. It was like he had to stoop to Jay's lowest common denominator level. And so from that point on, even before he got The Tonight Show, his own show kind of became bland. And then his incarnation of The Tonight Show was bland. And then the strangest part was, even when he got his show on cable, it was like he kept the bland thing going. He's sort of starting to improve. Now I'm way off topic. But my point is, when Conan put on the bland mask for clicks, so to speak, and it feels like Vasgersian is kind of a similar deal because listening to him in interviews or on MLB Network, he's really funny. He's really interesting. He's not afraid to speak his mind. He shows some emotion. He's not just a robot. And so that's why it's weird on ESPN how vanilla he is. He's just doesn't stand out at all. And I think it's because he's got a muzzle on or something. It's just a funny guy who, in the game, I've never laughed at anything he said. He's just a cookie cutter, typical play by play guy. And that's not who he actually is. So that's what's strange. As for Jessica Mendoza, I mean, I don't know what to say. I've never been a fan. She vacillates between making these vapid comments that a typical, somewhat knowledgeable fan might blurt out, or then she'll flip to some super specific stat that was clearly just handed to her right before the game. There's never anything that she says that makes me be like, oh, wow, interesting. It's just she's a cardboard cutout. So I don't understand why this group, why ESPN like is so stubborn about keeping them together. I think even just cutting Mendoza out of the picture, A-Rod and Vasgersian, that might be interesting. Give them a little space to flex the comedy or something. But where things stand now, it's like a really smart guy in A-Rod, but not the most entertaining guy. A funny guy in Vasgersian who's not allowed to be funny. And then, an emotionless statue in Jessica Mendoza. So that's my biggest criticism is just the group isn't fun or interesting to listen to. But I gotta give ESPN big props for the research team. They pulled up some really interesting stats, and it reminded me during the game. Well, the most interesting stat they found was the Matt Chapman fastball stat. How he had hit 206 on fastballs in the second half, 208 I think it was, but he had hit 306 on fastballs in the first half. So there was this dramatic decline, inexplicable, and it was just really interesting and important and relevant and made me think. And thinking of that made me reflect on past ESPN broadcasts, particularly in the playoffs, and remembering that this isn't the first time they've brought up a stat that was really like, oh wow, that I've never seen it. I've never seen a broadcast talk about this particular angle. So ESPN is really good at that. They've got a great team researching this stuff. And I even liked the graphics they showed with the home run trajectories. It was a little gimmicky, but I still thought it was cool, I'll admit. The only other complaint I'll throw out there about the broadcast, and this is definitely, I guess, the old man in me coming out, but was I alone in thinking the broadcast was like ridiculously loud? At one point, I was, you know, shying away from the ear-shattering volume after some play had happened, so I grabbed the remote to turn it down, and the volume on my TV was like a 7 or an 8. And nevertheless, I was like, oh, one step away from needing emergency ear surgery because of how loud it was. But again, maybe that's just me. As for the game itself, my prediction was that the Rays were going to win, but I had gone back and forth on that a little bit. I didn't think it was a slam dunk. I thought the teams were pretty evenly matched. I thought the A's had the better lineup, but the Rays had the better team. I thought ultimately in the end it would maybe be a close game, not a blowout, not a pitcher's duel. I was kind of picturing something in between, a 5-3 type game. Uh, as it turned out, it was not a high scoring game, but the Rays were just in complete control of the game. They dominated the game, even if they didn't score a ton of runs. So the way I saw it breaking down was I thought I was concerned about Mania for the A's because a guy who goes 4-0 with a 1.21 ERA down the stretch seems like he's due for a bad game. So that part I guess I was sort of right about, but I didn't think he would be as bad as he was. My angle was I thought Mania would take a step back, but looking at the Rays splits, I was like, this team's not as good against lefties. Uh, so I thought, even if Mania slips a little, I don't see the Rays jumping all over him, which, of course I was wrong about. The funny thing about him was Mania didn't have bad stuff. Like, he looked good at times in the brief amount he was in the game. It was just, I think the Rays did their homework, which is the typical story for the Rays. I think Manaea, it's easy to say he had bad stuff, but watching the game back, he didn't. The Rays just were taking good at bats. I think that's what it came down to. I think after Garcia hit the home run in the second, I think Manaea was a little bit deflated at that point. It wasn't like he rolled over or something. It felt a little bit like it wasn't his night at that point. I think he might have known that too. So after that, I think, as Vasgersian said during the game, the first inning was crucial. The fact that Morton got out of that jam without giving up any runs, he's got the bases loaded. He just didn't look sharp. And the fact that the A's couldn't scratch across anything, I mean, if they would have scored one run, it would have been a tie game. In the first inning, it would have been totally different. And they couldn't even do that. So it did feel like that was the game. The game was pretty much over in the first inning when the Rays scored. Manaea didn't look bad, but it was concerning. And then Morton pitches around a huge jam. It just didn't seem like the A's were going to get a ton more chances. Funny thing is, they actually did get a good amount, but they were not good with men on base in the game. They didn't seem to have a strategy, different approach with men on base. It was just sort of more of the same. It looked like they were easy to pitch to at times in that sense. But I think the second turning point in the game was in the third inning, I believe it was, when Simeon led off, reached third on the air. Great base running. And he had a good game. I mean, I don't think the box score will show it, but Simeon showed up, and if he would have had a little more support, I think he would have looked a little bit more like the MVP, the candidate that he was. Because as is, he still played really well. So he's at third, nobody out, and the score was 3-0 at that point, or maybe it was already 4-0. Yeah, it was already 4-0, but it was only the bottom of the third. But the very first pitch to Laureano after that, he hits the sac fly. And it was just sort of like good for the A's on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was like, well, now there's one out and nobody on base. So it was like, oh, the rally is over with. So that scoring the run the way that they did so quickly, and so it wasn't quick, it was abrupt. Doing it that way, it just felt like there was no energy to carry them to a second run. It felt like Morton had a clean slate. The inning, they weren't going to score again in the inning, so even maybe a longer at bat with a sac fly, even if it would have been the same scenario, but just the A's scored their one run in the game on two pitches. Ground ball to third, error, sac fly. They couldn't use that. There was no fuel for the rest of their offense with that as their rally. That was the way in which they scored that run, zapped them of their energy, I think, in a way. So the rest of the game was very forgettable. It was a sleepy second half of the game. Not much to analyze. The Rays kind of followed through on their plan. It seemed like what pitchers they wanted to use, it went according to plan. And unlike the Brewers yesterday, the plan worked. There was no implosion. So the other thing I wanted to get into was I had a whole speech written out in praise of the Oakland crowd. It was an awesome crowd. And as Vasgersian said, it seemed like they They had gotten there early. They were ready to go. They were pumped up. And I was a little bit surprised because I remember seeing some Oakland playoff crowds in the past and being like, thanks for showing up. But this was an awesome crowd. I don't know what it is about the team, but this particular season, but the crowd was really into it. The crowd performed better than a lot of the players on the A's, it seemed like to me. And they never lost that energy. It was a good crowd. But my praise was I had to kind of slow my roll a little bit once I started to think back on the simple question of where are these crowds during the regular season? Why do the A's draw so poorly? And I don't really buy the stadium sucks reasoning because yeah, the stadium's outdated, but and I'm sure there's probably geographical things that not being from that area I don't understand as far as like how to get to the ballpark, parking. There's probably issues with that, but the ballpark it's not it's not a hellhole or something. I mean, and there's more importantly, there's a good product on the field. So my next reaction, I was kind of on a little roller coaster here where, hey, this crowd's awesome. Hey, wait, why is this crowd particularly awesome, but they can't draw much during the regular season? And I sort of widened it out and started looking at the big picture, and what I realized is this A's team is like a paradox. The A's are probably the only team, or one of the only teams in the majors that have such a defined identity. They're the rough around the edges A's, the green shoe crew. This team really reflects Oakland. That's their identity and they live up to it. Part of it is, I mean, of course, part of it's marketing, but it's also the fact that the team is comprised of so many guys who have been thrown away by other teams. That's kind of how they have success, is the team is so well run that they find guys, they put together a roster of guys with huge chips on their shoulder, and it helps form that identity. So what's strange is this team with one of the most defined identities, closely linked to the community, and it seems like it's the real deal. This is a team that in the playoffs has no identity at all. And I'm not sure what that is exactly. They don't often get thrown in the category of like a regular season team, like the Braves of the 90s were, and a few of the teams that kind of followed that mold in the 2000s. But they're a little bit of that. It's a little bit of good enough to make the playoffs, but whatever formula they have is not good enough to win in the playoffs. And that's something that I think is a failure on Billy Beane's part. I mean, he's had enough time to where I know he would say that getting to the playoffs is hard enough. He can't guarantee anything after that. But my counter argument to that would be, well, you've been there enough times, you fail consistently and in similar ways. Isn't there some kind of calculation you can come up with to change that a little bit? I mean, I looked into their playoff appearances since 2000 in the Moneyball era, so to speak, and only the usual suspects, the Dodgers, St. Louis, the Yankees, have made the playoffs more than the A's. I think they're even tied with the Red Sox. So this team's in the playoffs a lot. And they're notorious for their, blowing the 2-0 lead in a couple of division series, but that only happened twice. A lot of these series I looked at they went 5 games in a bunch of these series, but sometimes they were up 2-1, sometimes they were down 2-1, and then of course infamously a couple times they were up 2-0. But in these series they lost in sort of different ways, but always forgettable ways. It was never, they don't have this long track record of crushing losses in the playoffs. There's the Jeter throw, of course, and there was the Ordonez Grand Slam to end their season in 2006 in the ALCS, but that series was already over. So it's strange to look at the A's the last 20 years because they sort of break down in two different halves, which I mean makes sense. But the 2000s, the aughts, the team was always in these series, and they won the one division series. And in the 2010s under Bob Melvin, it's been more of a team that is laying eggs nonstop. They never perform up to par in the postseason. And so it leaves me with this question of, for a team that knows its identity so well, to the point where they're arrogantly perhaps making films about it, writing books about it, marketing themselves in a certain way, where's the identity in the playoffs? Why are the A's the guys that don't care, the tough guys that don't take the game too seriously, but you don't want to mess with? Those A's for the 162 games of the season. Why, when the playoffs start, do the A's turn into the took a sleeping pill right before the game A's? It's a problem. And I wonder if that's part of the disconnect between the fans and the team. In either way, I think something needs to change in that formula. I know money is an issue in Oakland, so if their funds are going towards making the playoffs, that's good enough. But if it's Bob Melvin, if it's just a tinkering here or there, something needs to be injected into this franchise to give them a postseason identity. I mean, it's almost like a bad identity is worse than no identity situation, because you can't even say, oh, well, the A's, they always blow it in the playoffs, because there's not like a long history of heartbreaking losses. It's just, oh, the A's are in the playoffs. They were eliminated immediately. And who beat them? What was the score? Did anything interesting happen in these games? That's the A's. And that's a black eye on Billy Beane's otherwise successful tenure. So, thanks for bearing with me during my second video here. If you liked it, throw me a thumbs up. Maybe subscribe. If you do subscribe, congratulations, you're my 3rd subscriber. I'll be posting a video about the big playoff, the full game of playoffs tomorrow if everything goes as planned, so stick around for that. If you hated anything I had to say or hate me, then throw a comment below and I'll try to respond. Maybe we can have a little convo. Feel free to share this video. And again, I appreciate the click, I appreciate the view, and I'll see you soon.